Greetings, I am Josh McDonald and I would like to introduce you to the biblical criticism known as role of the reader. The method of role of the reader, also known as reader response criticism, has a very large brushstroke. From this one method, many others have been spurned, including post-colonial criticism, sociological criticism, feminist criticism, and African American criticism. The latter two will be discussed in more detail by other students in this class. Many would argue that this type of literary criticism should be considered a postmodern approach. Edgar McKnight illustrates this with his book entitled Postmodern Use of the Bible, with the subtitle, The Emergence of Reader-Oriented Criticism. He suggests that the contemporary readers are not uncritical, but have the need to move beyond the critical. However, Jane P. Tompkins points out that this form of criticism has been in place since Plato. She references his famous passage, "I cannot help feeling, Phaedrus, that writing is unfortunately like painting. For the creations of the painter have the attitude of life, and yet, if you ask them a question, they preserve a solemn silence, and the same may be said of speeches. You would imagine that they had intelligence, but if you want to know anything, put a question to one of them, and the speaker always gives the one unvarying answer. And when they have been once written down, they are tumbled about anywhere among those who may or may not understand them. And now to whom they should reply, to whom not. And if they are maltreated or abused, they have no parent to protect them, and they cannot protect or defend themselves." While this method is not new in the studies of literary theory and criticism, it has recently gotten a greater foothold within biblical scholarship. Robert Fowler states that it is his goal to build a bridge between these two separate realms and fuse them into one single continuous realm. With more emphasis being placed on the role of the reader, it is important that we understand what that means. Most methods of biblical criticism approach the text objectively, absolutely, and with respect to the author and the text that the author has provided. They answer questions like, who is the author? Why is he or she writing this text? What is the author's purpose in writing this text? Who is the author writing to, and why is he writing to them? When did he write it, and from where? Role of the reader criticism reverses this, instead focuses on the reader. This approach takes the position that if a tree falls in the forest and there is no one to hear it, then it must not have made a sound because there was no eardrums to receive the sound waves that were produced by the falling tree. Instead of text existing on its own and having the meaning within the text, this approach takes the view that the text exists only when it is read by its current reader. The phrase reader's liberation movement has been coined as a result of the emphasis placed on this model. Kevin J. Vanhoozer, the author of the essay in the required text, Hearing the New Testament, gives the answer to the question what readers have been liberated to do through this movement, and that is make meaning. He describes it this way: reading is not merely a matter of perception, but also of production. The reader does not discover so much as create meaning. Used as a tool, the reader response method gives the power of making meaning to the reader, removing the author from the equation. Proponents of this method argue that the reader, you and I, are distant from the author in three ways. The first, the way we think. Secondly, our place in history. And third, our language. At this point, the traditional critic would argue that it is our responsibility as the reader to study these three areas of the author to come to objective, determinate meaning, to which the proponent, like Ronald Bars, would counter that the author is a convenient fiction that provides the illusion of a stable sense of determinate meaning. Bars goes so far to say the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. In the umbrella of reader response criticism, there are several different approaches. The first and most radical approach originates from the school of Louise Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt argued that the text was only a guide of words and ideas provided by the author, but in the end, each reader would experience the text differently and thus responsible for the meaning. In the end, there is no right or wrong meaning, only the reader's meaning. Now, Stanley Fish, in his early writings on reader response criticism, presented a slightly less radical platform. His approach, which he called the informed reader, along with Wolfgang Iser's implied reader, allowed for the text and the author to have slightly more input into making the meaning. The informed reader acknowledged that each reader comes to the text with prior thoughts, traditions, and agendas that have an impact on the meaning that the reader comes to. The implied reader acknowledges that the author had an intended audience, but that there are gaps left by the author in the text that the reader has the freedom to fill. Influenced by both the reader's experience and the text, the meaning that results is a combination of the two. The most conservative approach in the arena of reader response criticism, and where Stanley Fish landed in his later writings, focuses on the interpretive communities. This approach is the only one that has any accountability involved, although very loosely. This approach gives the authority to create meaning to the group. This group could be a book club, a religious denomination, or an ideology. It is also important to mention that Umberto Eco classified literature into two groups of open and closed text. Some authors write literature that is intended to be interpreted by the reader, or was written in such a manner that the reader must create meaning. On the other hand, there is literature that is closed to the reader making meaning. He writes in the introduction of his book, Role of the Reader, that this type of literature apparently aim at pulling the reader along at a predetermined path, carefully displaying their effects so as to arouse pity or fear, excitement or depression at the due place and at the right moment. Surprisingly, Eco uses the fine literature of Superman comics as an illustration of this type of literature. He continues, every step of the story elicits just the expectation that his further course will satisfy. I personally come to the conclusion that the Bible is a closed text. Every step is satisfied in the fulfillment of Jesus Christ in the creation of the church. Clearly, there are those that would disagree with me. So allow me to demonstrate how the reader response method would be applied to Luke chapter 8, verses 16, 17, and 18, the parable of the lamp under a jar. Because there are multiple ways of approaching this scripture in the framework of reader response criticism, it is important that I establish which of these I will use for this illustration. I will attempt to approach this passage from the perspective of Stanley Fish's informed reader. I have prior thoughts, traditions, and agendas. To make this applicable, I will take on the role of a young man that was raised by a traditional Christian parents, but am now an openly homosexual. Let us first read the passage, Luke 8, 16, 17, and 18. No man, when he hath lighted a candle, covereth it with a vessel, or putteth it under a bed, but setteth it on a candlestick, that they which enter in may see the light. For nothing is secret, that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid, that shall not be known and come abroad. Take heed therefore how ye hear, for whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and whosoever hath not, for him shall be taken, even that which he seemeth to have. Because of my Christian foundation, in an effort to comfort my parents that I am not going to hell, I come across this scripture. I have been told by society and my peers that this is who I am, and that I should not hide it or cover it up. My coming out of the closet is in fact just letting the world see who I really am. That is my candle. I should not hide who God has made me to be. Besides, nothing that is done in secret is going to stay there. God knows who I am and how I am living, so there is no need to hide it. So this is what God has given me, and for me to not live it out would mean that even this life would be taken from me. Obviously, I am taking a very extreme position. Nevertheless, this is permitted when there is no accountability to the interpretation of Scripture. Jesus is in no way referencing a homosexual lifestyle when he spoke these words. In context and with an understanding of who the intended audience was, there is no way that you would come to this conclusion. This is the first and greatest defect to the reader response model. There is no accountability. No matter what meaning the individual or group creates, it cannot be wrong. Vanhoozer described it well when he said that it was possible for a reader to beat the text into the shape that will suit their purpose. In return, it opens the door to what I would call the academic or theological bully. The one who holds the most power or influence controls the meaning of the text. If you don't like the meaning that they have established, too bad. Stanley Fish illustrates another issue with reader response. In his own life and literature, his objective changed. But this is possible because there is no such thing as objective meaning or determinate meaning. Finally, this approach to the Bible, especially implementing this radically, is not possible. The Bible is full of facts, laws, principles, logic, and conclusions that are not open to interpretation. To simply say there is no determinate meaning is laziness. The one single positive element that I can establish from the reader response method is that it openly acknowledges the reader. If we are honest, we are all guilty of implementing this method to our biblical studies at one level or another. At least the reader response method admits that this is what they are doing. I hope that you have found this overview of reader response helpful. Blessings.